Hello and welcome to this course on research methodology. My name is Debashish Banerjee. I'm your instructor for this course. You may be wondering what a course on research methodology is all about, because it seems to be not a particular subject that you really signed up for. But it really is a way by which you can enter into a scholarly community. Research methodology prepares you to work on the kind of problems that you're dealing with in a systematic manner that follows certain protocols or standards that are acceptable to the entire scholarly community. It is also something that teaches you a language and a way of thinking that is what we call scholarly. What is meant by scholarly today in the 21st century is not necessarily what scholarly or scholarship meant in every culture at all times. It is something that is related to the birth of science and the Enlightenment and modern understandings of knowledge. In today's lecture, I will introduce research methodology from the viewpoint of what you can expect in this course. And in the next lecture, we'll talk a little bit about scientific method, because research methodology is the kind of methodology followed to make our understanding scientific, so that even though we are not researching what is normally known as hard science, we are part of the scientific community of scholarship. That is part of what modern knowledge production is all about. So, what are the goals of research methodology? Research methodology, as far as we are all concerned, gives us two kinds of goals. One is to plan and carry out your own research projects. So, the research projects that you will carry out will follow a certain kind of method, and that method will be something that will add to the fund of knowledge that is available to all humankind. And that's part of the method that you will be taught and that you will internalize for your own purposes of research. And the second is you will become part of the community of scholars who will be able to understand and interpret scholarship and research reports when you read them, identifying their major elements and underlying methodologies. In other words, you as a reader of scholarship will now develop a different kind of perspective on scholarship. You will be able to see how exactly it fits or meshes into the total body of knowledge, what position it occupies and how it references, because knowledge in today's world is a seamless ocean of various kinds of research that is ongoing. And you as a researcher in whatever subject you choose are becoming a participant both as a producer of knowledge and as a receiver of knowledge. So, our first question is, what is research and how do we define it? And this is a certain kind of definition that we can give to research. Research is a systematic and organized form of continuous attention applied to a field of knowledge, undertaken to establish facts, relations, principles, and theories. So, if we simplify this, the really simple version is research is a systematic way by which we answer questions. Now, the reason we put it in this slightly more complex form has to do with some of the phrases that I used in this definition. What is continuous attention, for example? Now, you realize that the word research has got the prefix re applied to the very common term search. What this implies is that we are searching again. And this whole notion of searching again is linked to our experience of the world. Our normal experience of the world is a given experience. We find ourselves in the world, and philosophers like Martin Heidegger have called this human condition one of thrownness. We find ourselves thrown. We don't enter the world with a beginner's manual. We have to swim on the go, as it were. So this kind of condition is one in which we naturally are searching all the time. Searching is part of the human condition to even survive. But research implies that we search again. The term has a reflexive component to it. In other words, turning within, turning into ourselves. And this research implies that we follow a certain method in our searching, which both searches ourselves as well as the subject that we have always confronted, but now in a new way. Now, this research, this searching again, applies also to the fact that the search is ongoing. And again, as I mentioned, as a researcher, you have entered into the ongoing production of knowledge in the modern world. And this production is something which is continuous. So when I mention continuous attention, what I mean is that the search of any particular topic or subject is ongoing, that there is already research connected with it, and you are inserting yourself into that field and expanding it. And so the research is the continuing search of knowledge that is expanding in any topic, and it is the continuing search in a systematic and organized manner that you are conducting on questions that you have approached or that face you, even if you've never really thought about them, on an ongoing basis. Now, the other key terms or key words in that definition are systematic and organized. Now, these terms refer to the scientific method. And as I mentioned, we'll take up the scientific method in greater detail in our next class or lecture. Systematic and organized means that what we are going to study is no longer a certain kind of haphazard search or study based on our subjective preferences, that we will exhaust the various possibilities in that topic. That is the systematic part of it. And that we will follow a method in which what we search for is given a form or shape that is organized. In other words, there will be classifications involved in it. There'll be relations involved in it. There'll be ways by which what we talk about fits into the existing body of knowledge that others have provided, as well as that gives us a certain kind of understanding that can be taken into a composed form. Now, the third part of that definition has to do with establishing facts. You see, it says, applied to a field of knowledge undertaken to establish facts, relations, principles, and theories. The first one of those things that we are trying to establish are facts. Now, facts again are all around us. And when we talk about researching for facts, what we mean is that we want to actually give a more systematic and organized description to what exists. You, for example, may be living in a community, but you've never really thought of giving a systematic description to that community. What are the demographics of that community? what are the various skill sets of that community, what are the various needs of that community. To provide a systematic and organized description of what stands in front of you or what you have posed as a problem is one kind of research. It is called descriptive research. And descriptive research concerns itself with facts that it organizes in a classified form so that there is a clear picture, as it were, of the topic that is being researched. We also have the term relations, undertaken to establish relations. So establishing relations puts us face to face with another kind of research or some other kinds of research, such as explanatory research and correlational research. So we find that not only are we necessarily interested in describing something that we see, we may find that there are cause and effect relations, or that there are relations that we are not clear about, that there are a variety of factors that are related in some way that is not apparent to us, but that we'd like to explain how these relations work. So our research is conducted to understand the relationship between various factors and forces in the question that is presented. And that kind of research is explanatory research. We end up with an explanation. We may have another kind of research that is correlational. In that correlational case, we have distinct factors. We are more clear about our factors. And we know that one factor affects another. And what we want to establish is, how does it affect? How does one factor affect the other? These factors that we are talking about are called variables. So once we move out of the field of description to understanding research as explanation and correlation, we are also talking about identifying variables, in other words, factors which change, and finding how they change in relation to each other. If we know clearly that certain factors are related to other factors, what is the nature of that relation? How does the change in one affect the change in the other? That is correlational research. Finally, we may have the establishment of principles and theories. And this is a little more complex. In other words, we are not merely interested in how things affect each other, but coming to generalities that may be smaller or narrower or broader. In other words, very broad generalities that can explain a lot. These are exploratory research, and they lead to discovery. So exploratory research starts with certain kinds of situations that we don't know enough about, and we are interested in finding out what are the principles that constitute it. You, for example, may want to know how it would be to live in another country. And so you would conduct exploratory research to find out what it is that the living conditions over there are like. You might do questionnaires, surveys, look at the various kinds of statistics in that particular situation, and then operate on those statistics to find out certain principles that guide these particular situations, and that would be a exploratory kind of research. So what we see is that research can be of a variety of kinds, and you as a student may be interested in one or other of these kinds. You may be interested in a descriptive kind of research, as I said, may be interested in finding out how best to describe a certain body of works, What are the factors in it? What are the various kinds of components in it? How can you give what is called a necessary and sufficient description to it? Or you may be very interested in how a certain situation has factors that relate to each other, how they correlate, or how you can explain these changing situations within a particular situation. And finally, you may be interested in an exploratory kind of research. In other words, how would you arrive at a description of something that is not clear or self-evident? What would you do to get the data from there to arrive at a picture either of a descriptive nature or of a correlative nature in terms of exploration? So from this definition of research, we find that research has certain characteristics. It's important to understand this because the term research is much misused in our day. You see, particularly with the advent of Google, everybody is conducting research. This has become a buzzword. You know, you ask somebody, do you know what this is? I'll do some Google research on it. Well, what they're doing really is not research as we are defining it. What they're doing is a kind of amateur literature survey. Now, it's very important to do literature survey of that kind within the research process. And one entire lecture will be devoted to literature survey and how important it is to establish the parameters of research. But research methodology is, as you may already be getting a sense of, much more complex than that, and it involves a lot more in terms of the rigor with which you conduct research and the various elements within it. So the characteristics of research that we have established so far are that it is controlled. Now, controlled means, now you may wonder how we can control ongoing situations of life are happening, they're unfolding. How can we research them if we control them? Well, the idea of controls again belongs to the very wide boundaries of what is called the scientific method. Scientific method is controlled. It's controlled because the life itself provides too many factors that interfere with each other. So we have to reduce those factors if we are to understand the very basic elements of what it is that we are searching. So we need to control our topic. Control in the hard sciences is easier to achieve because we are talking about substances, materials, experimental laboratory, experimental conditions, etc. But when we talk about the kind of research that is being conducted, for example, by students who are studying philosophy, psychology, consciousness studies, or social studies, we're talking about different kind of science. These are the social sciences, or these are the human sciences. Sociology is the quintessential social science. Psychology is one of the quintessential human sciences. Anthropology is a good bridge between the human sciences and the social sciences. Biology is more like a hard science, but with a kind of crossover to what we call the human sciences. These are known as the soft sciences. Now, since we are concerned more with soft sciences than hard sciences of physics, chemistry, and things of that nature, we have to understand that our main subject arises out of life itself. We can't control it to the same degree that a physicist can control experiments in a laboratory. But we can control some amount, depending on the topic or the question that you've posed to yourself, there are ways by which you can design your research into control groups. And social research, social science research does create control groups. In some cases, you cannot even do that because you want to research a live situation. Even in those cases, there is a certain amount of control going on because you are interested in certain aspects of a living situation. Those aspects themselves presuppose and offer up their own controls. In other words, how will you test for certain types or aspects of a living situation so that other kinds of interferences are minimized? You will either be able to quantify those other factors and account for them, or you'd be able to focus on certain factors in such a way that the other factors do not constitute your experiment or your research design. So in any case, there is a certain amount of controlled concern in all research. The second characteristic is all research is rigorous. Rigor means that research follows relevant procedures. The procedures are set up beforehand, and these procedures are followed in an extremely strict manner. That's what the meaning of rigor is. Rigor is stricture. You set up your own stricture so that there isn't loopholes. There aren't any loopholes for various kinds of extraneous elements to enter into your research. Rigor implies understanding what it is that is extraneous and what it is that is internal to your research. And it also implies the use of logic. So logic is a very important tool in research methodology. You have to use logic, or particularly the deductive and inductive forms of logic. We will deal with this in greater detail in the second lecture. But you need these to establish what it is that you will follow as a relevant procedure. Other forms of similar logical functions in research include systematicity. So that is another characteristic of research. Research is systematic. In other words, it follows logical sequences and necessary and sufficient conditions. Necessary and sufficient conditions are very important and key to understand what that means, those terms mean, as far as research is concerned. Necessary and sufficient conditions have to be arrived at for whatever it is that you're going to study in a research project. It means that you are going to give a certain type of description in your research which has factors that are necessary to that particular problem. You have to identify what are absolutely necessary to a certain kind of problem or situation. And you have to identify what set of necessary factors are sufficient to that description. You can't have any unnecessary elements in your description, and you can't have more or less number of factors to your description. It's important to ponder this. So please give some thought to this understanding of the necessary and sufficient conditions of any particular question or problem, because that will determine the systematic nature of your study. Another characteristic, a fourth characteristic, is that research has to be valid and verifiable. And this is the factor or characteristic that relates to what I introduced right in the beginning. Research is not conducted merely for yourself. this systematic, organized procedure of arriving at knowledge is something that you are undertaking so that it will become part of the human storehouse of knowledge. And therefore, it has an impersonal component to it. It is not merely personal. It should be scientifically established in such a way that anybody can repeat it. Repeatability. Whatever it is that you are researching will be the same conclusions will be possible to arrive at by anybody else. So it is universally repeatable. It is this factor of being universally repeatable that establishes it as a universal truth. So that's how knowledge builds on knowledge. We stand on the shoulders of those who went in the past because they have established forms of knowledge that we can repeat even today and arrive at the validity of those forms of knowledge. What you will produce as knowledge will similarly become, irrespective of how meager it is or how small its applicability is, it will become a universally valid piece of knowledge that others will build on. The next characteristic of research is empiricism. In other words, it's empirical. Now, this term empirical is understood in many ways. Also, it's confusing because, again, the question of when we are talking about research which is not that of hard science, when we are talking about the human sciences, when we are talking about the social sciences, what does empiricism mean? And we'll see that there are people who have questioned this entire ground of empiricism in the human sciences, particularly when we look at what are called the paradigms of research. But nevertheless, what we do have to bear in mind is that one of the problems that was encountered at the very beginning of what we call the modern age is the necessity of arriving at a common datum of knowledge. In other words, knowledge cannot be entirely subjective. If you say that I see a plate as green and I say that I see the plate as red, we are not going to have any meeting place for our understanding of what that plate is. We can't describe it in any universal terms. Now, of course, this very example that I gave becomes one of the ways by which the whole enterprise of scientific knowledge has alienated itself from human experience. You do find, in fact, the field of modern art which has veered away towards expressionism. And it begins with statements like the one I made by great artists like Paul Cézanne, who said, "I never see a plate as round, and so why should I paint it as round?" So this is subjectivism. But scientific knowledge rests on universal validity, and therefore it has to find a common datum. Now, we may say that another kind of common datum may be found in a universal subjectivity. Are there universal structures that are objective within the subjective experience? So we may say that there are some people who may claim that mysticism is of that nature. Experience of God is of that nature. We all have the same kind of experience of God. This is what is known as the perennial philosophy. It moves towards the affirmation of a universal spirituality. The teaching of Ernest Holmes is of that nature too. But what scientific research does, it looks for its universal datum at the other end of things. It says that our sensory inputs are what all human beings share in common, and our logical functions are what all human beings share in common. We can fine-tune or extend our sensory inputs. In other words, we can use microscopes to look at a more detailed level of things. We can use telescopes to look at the stars. But nevertheless, we are only extending our senses, and we are using the logical functions of the mind, of the reason, to arrive at deductions based on these sensory inputs. Again, in the case of human and social sciences, all this becomes questionable because we are dealing with subjective beings. Human beings are subjective beings. Nevertheless, we have to keep in mind that one of the characteristics of research is empiricism. In other words, its conclusions have to, at some level, be based on sensory inputs. Sensory inputs have to be acknowledged. We'll see again when we deal with paradigms of research how complicated this gets. Finally, a characteristic of research is that it is critical. By critical, we mean there is criticism involved in it. Criticism is a central element of scientific research. Scientific research or research methodology needs to lend itself to criticism. All procedures can be questioned, and they can be questioned on the grounds of necessity and sufficiency, so that they are whittled away, and what remains at the end has to be verifiable. And this validity or verifiability will ultimately determine whether it stands the test of criticism or not. So all research must be criticizable. What are the kinds of research or types of research that there are when we are talking about looking at various functions of research? What functions does research lend itself to? And research lends itself to three kinds of functions. One is called pure research. Pure research means seeking of knowledge without any thought of application. In other words, you only want to understand something, and this is related to what we call descriptive research as well. You want to describe something because you want to arrive at a complete understanding of it. You want to put it in a certain form in which it is comparable to other things in the realm of pure knowledge. So in terms of hard sciences, this is what the whole field of science is all about. Science in its pure meaning means pure knowledge. Okay? Science, omniscience, science, in other words. Science is to know. So just our ability to know, our ability to capture an understanding, a comprehension, a cognition of things is pure science. Now, a lot of social science is not of that nature. A lot of social science is conducted because we want to apply knowledge. In other words, we want to better the world we live in. And if we want to better the world we live in or apply our knowledge in certain ways, we need to enter into an understanding of how things relate and how we can structure or use the structure of things to modify them, make them better. And that kind of knowledge is called applied knowledge. Applied knowledge is a seeking of knowledge which can be applied to achieve a certain goal. So again, to look at the realm or domain of pure science or pure research, if we say that science refers to pure research, we can say that technology refers to applied research. Technology is the way in which things are related so that we can operate on them. We can have a certain kind of modificatory intent acting on the knowledge that we have. The third kind of knowledge, functionally speaking, is practical knowledge. We move further into application or into operation in practical knowledge. Practical knowledge seeks the knowledge of things for dynamic action in the process of application. So you may wonder what is the difference between applied knowledge and practical knowledge. Maybe the best way to understand it is that certain forms of knowledge are only acquired in the doing. It is dynamic in that sense, dynamic knowledge. You can learn as much as you wish to in theory how much or what kinds of movements you need to make with your hands and legs to swim. But until you are thrown into the water, you never acquire the practical knowledge of swimming. So this is what practical knowledge is all about. It's knowledge in the doing. It's dynamic knowledge. And so research functionally can either be pure, in which case you're not interested in understanding any kind of application, applied knowledge. You just need to understand things. It can be applied in the sense that you're arriving at a certain understanding which can help you to better things or change things for the better or worse, as the case may be. And it could be practical knowledge, which is really about how things function in the dynamism, in the movement of doing something. Now, another kind of element that needs to be addressed in research methodology and needs to be understood right at the beginning is that of the modes of knowing in research. And this relates to the broad field in philosophy known as epistemology. Epistemology is the philosophy of knowing. How do we arrive at knowledge? And this is very important because, again, as I said, we are talking about scientific knowledge. And often we find that our actual ways of knowing in the world are very different from knowledge as we know it scientifically. So I'm laying down over here the kinds of knowledge that we normally use, and also trying to show you that there is a place for every kind of knowledge in research methodology. One kind of knowledge is what we call intuitive knowledge. Intuitive knowledge is based in belief, faith, hunches, and feelings. I have an intuition. I have a gut feeling. I move with my intuitions. Okay, so there are much of our life is actually led that way. There are people who have a strong confidence in their intuitions, in intuitive capacities. And I wouldn't, I'm sure almost all, maybe every human being, some part of their life, whether they acknowledge it or not, is run through intuitions. Now, the question is, this kind of intuitive movement is in some ways contradictory to what we call research. Because as I said right in the beginning, in our normal operations in life, we find ourselves thrown into life. And the way we acquire knowledge to survive, to get ahead, to become more prosperous is usually largely intuitive, or it's a combination of intuitional knowledge and logical knowledge. But we find that when we do research, we are being asked to be systematic and organized. We are being asked to use our logic to classify things, to arrive at factors that are necessary and sufficient, to relate these factors and find out their correlations. So how does intuition play into this? Is intuition entirely contraindicated as far as research is concerned? The answer is no, though it seems to be contraindicated to the enterprise of research. There is one aspect of research in which intuitions play a very important part, and that is the building of hypotheses. We'll find as we go on that research rests on a very important step of determining hypothesis. A hypothesis is your understanding of what a certain situation or question that you've posed to yourself, what is the answer? What do you think is the answer? And that answer that you give is what you will now test to verify or validate or invalidate. That is one of the ways in which research proceeds. And so to come up with a certain hypothesis, we often use intuitions. Now, we don't only use intuitions in arriving at hypothesis. We use a number of different factors or forms of knowledge. One of them is intuition, but intuition must support itself through other kinds of knowledge as well. For example, hearsay. Somebody told me, many people told me that such and such a thing happens. Or literature survey. I read many books in which they say such and such a thing happens. Particularly if those books are not scholarly in nature, what you have received is another kind of common or popular understanding, belief or faith. You have your own belief or faith. Hearsay is a kind of belief of faith. So all these will add up to give you support and strength in forming a hypothesis. Another kind of mode of knowledge, or in epistemology, in the forms of more modes of knowing, is authoritative knowledge. Authoritative knowledge is based on established sources or authorities, such as professional literature. Authorities could be, again, they don't need necessarily to be scholarly. That's why I said it doesn't need to be organized and systematic, but you may have somebody with a lot of practical knowledge. You have somebody who has much experience, and that person's authority comes from his or her experience. So you may have a leader of a cult. You may have a leader of a spiritual group. All these, you may have a great scientist, or let's say a great artist or a great musician. Whatever this person says about his or her own craft or knowledge is authoritative. And so you give some value to it. However, that authoritative knowledge may not be scientific knowledge. It may not be researched. It may not be systematic. It may just be something that the person has established due to their own experience. Okay? So, however, we do find authoritative knowledge in research methodology, and that's what I mentioned over there in terms of professional literature. So, professional literature is research methodology which is scholarly and authoritative at the same time. It draws its authority from the fact that a lot of experience is encapsulated in a systematic and organized form which can be universally validated. So that's where it is research established through research, but at the same time it is authoritative knowledge. A third mode of knowing is logical, and this is the exercise of induction and deduction. And in our next class we'll deal a little more with these two central pillars of scientific method. Okay, logical thinking. Okay. Now, this is, of course, a key factor in research methodology. One may say that this is the central type or mode of knowing in research methodology. And logical thinking is utilized particularly when we reason from findings to conclusions. In research methodology, actually, we use logic at every stage to design our research, to arrive at hypotheses, to collect data, and then to utilize data, analyze data to come to conclusions. Particularly, that last stage is a very critical stage involving logic. Finally, we have the empirical mode of knowing, which is based on objective facts established through sensory observations. So this, of course, we utilize in research methodology, as I've already explained, again in a very key and critical form, through the procedures that lead to findings. Procedures that that help us to arrive at facts, and facts that will lead us to findings. So going back to these modes of knowing in research, epistemology, logical and empirical modes of knowing are the central ones that we use in research methodology. And they are supported by authoritative knowledge, which comes in terms of professional literature as literature surveys, as well as in terms of the knowledge that comes through experience of others that helps us to form hypotheses, and finally by our own intuitions that also help us to form hypotheses that we can test out to validate or invalidate as part of our research methodology. Now, we come to the question of research paradigms. Research paradigms have to do with perspectives on reality. How we will look at something is, our research method, which rests on how we look at the world. Okay? Perspectives on reality, just as we talked about methods of knowing that form a certain branch of philosophy called epistemology, methods of being, how we are in terms of our relationship with the world, form the branch of philosophy known as ontology. Ontology is the philosophy of being. So what kind of perspective do we have on reality, and how does that affect our research? This is called research paradigms. The term paradigms has become quite popular in modern times, and in modern thinking, in research thinking, in particularly in the philosophy of science, the term was introduced by the philosopher Thomas Kuhn, and he proposed two major kinds of paradigms. And particularly, again, we look at what we earlier defined as the hard sciences, which is physics, chemistry, etc., that deal with objective material realities that can be easily externalized, isolated, and operated on. That kind of research is what lay behind the origins of research, and that paradigm of that kind is called positivism. The term positivism as a paradigm of research methodology was given by the sociologist Auguste Comte, and it means that reality is restricted to observable data, and of course it can be quantitative or qualitative. By that is meant that we don't assume any kind of subjective or extra objective reality. All the reality that we have is what can be observed, that our senses observe. That is reality. And we can observe it either in quantitative terms, in other words, we can measure it, its volume, its weight, its other physical properties, or we can describe it in qualitative terms. So what is its color, what is its form, what is its shape, etc. These are various descriptive research factors in the paradigm known as positivism. But however, positivism has come in for a lot of criticism, and as I said, particularly when we look at the human sciences and the social sciences, we find that human beings, even living things in general, are not that easy to separate from ourselves, and they don't lend themselves so easily as objects. There is a intermixture, there is what we call intersubjectivity that occurs in our trying to observe and understand other living things. So this has led to an entire new branch of thinking, or a paradigm on reality and ontology, that can be called post-positivism. Post-positivism also today applies to the hard sciences, because quantum physics has problematized the objective nature of things, which are also material. Material things are also no longer fully understandable in objective and observable terms. The reality that they represent is more complex and has certain other kinds of dimensions to them than purely observable data. Okay. So post-positivism is the paradigm that says that it combines empirical observations with logical reasoning. In other words, we can never arrive at a full description or understanding of the reality that we are studying or researching merely through our senses. We have to interpret it. We have to apply our understanding to it. So it comes from the view that science is probabilistic, as I said, quantum physics, as well as the human sciences. And so at any point, to predict the behavior, whether of a material object or of a living thing, is a probability. It is a probability function. There's a number of possibilities there. And this kind of post-positivistic paradigm can also be qualitative, ethnographic, ecological, or naturalistic. These are a variety of approaches. Qualitative approach, of course, in a post-positivistic sense, means that we understand things from a more subjective point of view. Of course, again, an intersubjective point of view, something which honors that which we are studying and tries to arrive at a internal subjective understanding of that thing. Ethnographic implies that people are culturally embedded. They have different cultural presuppositions, even to the degree of what it means to be human. And so we talk about emic and etic, or internal and external cultural understandings of social realities. And that leads to ethnographic approaches of a post-positivistic kind. Or ecological approaches also treat cultures as systems which have a certain internal dynamic. And in understanding how this dynamic works as a system, we are looking both at our relationship with that system and the relationship of things within the system in both objective and subjective ways. So post-positive is combining both the empirical observations with interpretations. And of course, naturalistic is in terms of observed nature and the way in which natural factors or forces operate both psychologically as well as physically. Now, post-positivism itself as a paradigm has split into two kinds of paradigms. One is the subjectivist paradigm, which treats the world as a subjective construction. In other words, whatever it is that we are looking at, whatever it is that we are studying, doesn't have any reality, or even if it does have a reality, we are not interested in that reality. Whatever we call reality is a construct. It's a subjective construct. People believe that it is the reality that they describe it as and live in. Okay, we live in a reality that is given to us in the form of a belief system, a construct. And the other kind of post-positivistic paradigm is the critical realist paradigm, which doesn't hold that the world is entirely a subjective construction. It holds that the world is objectively real, but that human beings cannot arrive at a full understanding of this objective reality. This is very critical realism is a very key contribution of the Enlightenment philosopher Immanuel Kant. It is Kantian in that sense, and it is believed that we have an objective reality, but human beings, like all other living things, are always interpreting. What we get is only what we can understand of it as finite, sensory, sentient, logical beings. So by understanding our reality, we arrive at a certain kind of understanding which is increasingly plausible, but always an interpretation. So these are various post-positivistic understandings or paradigms that many people follow in contemporary times, particularly in the social sciences and the human sciences. However, positivism still has a stronghold, and in our understanding of research, we will lend ourselves to both positivistic and post-positivistic forms of understanding research. So with that, we come to a basic understanding of the research process. And the research process is what you will be studying in this course. So what is the research process? How do you proceed to conduct research? And these are the various steps that you can see. These steps are sequential, though you find that some of them overlap. And we will study each of these steps in this course as a kind of a lesson in itself. And we'll find that our research projects will follow that particular sequence. So in a research process, you first need to identify a research question. A research question is a very broad thing. It has to do with what is the topic, not the specific topic, but the area that you are going to research, what interests you as a area that you want to study. That is the broad research question. From the question, you will elicit a problem, which is a more specific thing. What in this broad area, as you focus on it, can be articulated as a problem that can be defined in terms of verifiable data. Okay, so that is formulating a research problem. Once you formulated a research problem, you need to see where you stand. In other words, what do others know about this? Maybe the problem has already been solved. Maybe somebody already has an answer. Or maybe people have said a variety of things about this particular problem, and you need to know that. And so you go through a first level literature review, literature review 1. And that level of literature review deals in broad generalities. You find out what is the state of research as far as that problem is concerned. Based on that, based on your own experience, your own hunches, based on other information that you've gathered, you arrive at a hypothesis. A hypothesis is some way by which a research problem is given a tentative solution. What do you think is the solution? It has to be backed up. It's not arbitrary. It is not intuitive in an arbitrary sense, but it is intuitive in a sense that has some content that can be backed up. Then one identifies the variables. In other words, what are the various kinds of changing factors in that particular situation, or what it is in that situation you will study that you want to study. In other words, those are your variables. So you identify your variables. At this stage, you return to a second, a more detailed literature review. So this literature review actually takes you into the nitty-gritties of the various papers and various books that have been written on the problem that you have identified as your problem. And from that, you construct what is called a theoretical framework. What are the various theories that have been proposed about this particular problem? And from those theories, what will you use? Have you arrived at a certain theoretical framework that relates to your own problem? So the construction or establishment of a theoretical framework. After you do that, you will now create a design, a research design. Establish or creating a research design means how will you approach the research? What controls will you set up? What kinds of instruments of data collection will you design? How will you go about implementing these instruments so that they can collect the data that is necessary? So the next step is that the creation of the instruments of data collection. These are like questionnaires, survey forms, certain kind of a method for arriving at knowledge. These, whatever you set to yourself as the instruments of data collection, are then established. At this point, you are ready to write a research proposal. Now, here we need to stop, and I need to explain to you that as far as this course is concerned, you will not only be studying these things, but you will be undertaking a theoretical research for yourself. You will identify for yourself a question, a research problem, and then you will go through the process that we've just talked about up until the writing of a research proposal. In other words, you will thrash out your problem theoretically in your own mind. You will do the literature review that is necessary, arrive at your own hypothesis, and make a theoretical framework, design your research instruments and all that kind of thing, and write it all out. How are you going to conduct this form of research? That's your research proposal. After the research proposal is written, the next steps necessary are the actual collection of the data, the analysis and processing of the data, and the arrival at conclusions based on that analysis, and the writing of reports. So those four last steps, the collection of data, the processing of data, the arriving at conclusions, and the writing of report, we will not be doing in this particular course. Our course will encompass all these steps up to the writing of a research proposal. But of course, at the end of your tenure in this institution, you will be writing a thesis, which will be a kind of research paper. And that's where you will arrive at conclusions and write your reports, do the entire thing. This course is a miniature approach preparing you for that. That's what it's meant to be. And what you will do up until the midterm is related to the first few of those factors in research process. You'll identify a research question, formulate a research problem, do some literature review, construct a hypothesis, identify the variables, And that's about what you'll do up until the midterm. And then you will establish a theoretical framework, create your research design and the instruments of your data collection, and write your research proposal by the end of the course. This is what this course will constitute. We will use the internet a lot. So throughout this course, apart from the lectures and the texts, I want you to participate in the forums in a very active manner, and I will be participating with you to thrash out in each of your case what these various factors will be. What is your research question? What is your research problem? How will you arrive at a hypothesis, etc.? All these factors will be worked out collectively by each person, consulting with each other and with me through the forum discussions. And by the end of the course, you will be coming up with a research proposal, which I'm sure each of you will find is very satisfying to the various wonderful aspirations with which you have come into the study. Thank you. That's all I have for the first lecture.